This is AM Agenda.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm David Lipson. On the program today, calls from the opposition for new immigrants to be given lessons on personal hygiene. We'll also cross to the United States, where in New Hampshire, the Republican race for the White House is gathering some serious steam. But first, to the anti-whaling protesters who've been detained aboard a Japanese government security ship for several days. Confirmation this morning, after several days of diplomatic wrangling, that Japan will set them free. That confirmation came from the Attorney General, Nicola Roxon, earlier this morning.
I'm very pleased to be able to say that we have some good news today. The Japanese government has confirmed that they will release these three men, that they're not to be charged. And we now have today a very complex job of working out how that actual release and handover can be safely undertaken now that these vessels are out in open seas.
We'll go straight to our political panel now. Liberal Senator Gary Humphries joins me here in the Canberra studio. Gary, thanks for your time. And from Melbourne, Kelvin Thomson, Labor MP, thank you for your time and Happy New Year to both of you.
Yes, Happy New Year to you, David and Gary.
I want to start first with you, Kelvin Thomson. That announcement from Nicola Roxon this morning also came with a warning of sorts for activists that perhaps she could not guarantee the same treatment would be afforded to anyone else who attempts what these three have done. Do you think that Japan has acted properly and promptly here? And do you have any message to any other activists?
Well, I suppose, David, from my own point of view, I strongly support anti-whaling protest activities. I think that what the Japanese have been doing in relation to whales is completely wrong and improper, and that anti-whaling activists are entitled to, and I welcome their engaging in activities designed to bring what I think is a barbaric practice to a stop. But having said that, they are in the same situation as any other Australian who undertakes activities outside Australia's territorial jurisdiction, and that is you simply can't ask the Australian government to bail you out if you get into trouble. You have to accept the consequences of your own actions, and that's true for anti-whaling activists as it is for anyone else who steps beyond Australia's territorial jurisdiction.
Gary, would you agree with that? And also, it's worth pointing out that this was not a whaling ship as such that they boarded. It was actually a security ship that was shadowing the Steve Irwin.
Well, look, I certainly wouldn't defend the actions of these individuals, but I think that the Australian government needed to have acknowledged that this was almost inevitable. There were activist ships in the area. There were whaling ships. There was bound to be a confrontation. The Shadow Environment Minister, Greg Hunt, wrote to the Prime Minister on 3 separate occasions in December saying we've got to do something to head off this kind of confrontation. It has now happened, and fortunately the Japanese government's decided to not proceed with charges, but this could have been a very messy situation, and frankly the government's policy on whaling is in some chaos, and the fact that they today are now trying to sort of move on and do something else is an indication of the fact that they've been fortunate rather than have planned this very well to find themselves now without charges being laid against these 3 men.
We heard yesterday Tony Abbott saying that it's been long-standing coalition policy to have an Australian customs vessel posted in the Southern Ocean during whaling season. But as recently as 2007, we heard from Malcolm Turnbull, John Howard and Alexander Downer in the previous government, all saying that would be a ridiculous idea, that it would be reckless, an empty gesture. John Howard said, what, is he going to shoot them? So it's not that long-standing, is it?
Well, look, it's clearly we have to assess the situation. It's clear that we haven't yet negotiated our way out of international whaling. Most of the world opposes whaling, but unfortunately there are still countries like Japan which do choose to whale. Now, we've got to have a realistic policy to prevent, if we can, the continuation of this practice, but also to make sure that our oceans, the oceans around Australia, don't become the scene of international incidents, and particularly ones that threaten life or property. The fact is that this situation a few days ago was entirely foreseeable. The federal government knew that there were people in that part of the world. They did nothing to prevent it from happening. Let's not forget that the federal Labor government said before the 2007 election that it was going to send gunboats to that region to prevent whalers arriving at all. Then it was going to monitor the situation. Now it was going to take the situation to the International Court of Justice. All of those policies, like much that this government is doing, are turning over all the time and changing all the time. And now they expect us to believe that they've got this under control. The fact is they haven't. We don't know what the next step is, and we don't know what the government's going to do to prevent future incidents of this kind from occurring in those seas.
Kelvin Thomson, the one policy the government is pushing ahead with is an attempt to take Japan to the International Court. Evidence has been gathered by an Australian ship over the past year or so. But why is it taking so long to go through the process of trying to bring Japan to justice over whaling?
Oh, we don't control the International Court of Justice, David, and we're subject to their processes and procedures. But I do think it's very odd that the Liberal opposition is now saying that there ought to be vessels down there when, as you pointed out earlier, when they were in government, they were vehemently opposed to the idea and said that no point would be served by doing it. And these are the people who are always complaining about the nanny state and saying that government ought to keep out of people's lives, but you've got the likes of Greg Hunt getting up now and saying, oh, here's a problem, the government ought to fix it. What this essentially is a dispute between the anti-whaling activists and the Japanese government over the actions of the Japanese government. And they are right to seek a change from the Japanese government. They should be lobbying the Japanese people to get changes in the position in Japan in relation to whaling, and I totally support their actions. But expecting the Australian government to resolve this problem when it occurs outside Australia's territorial jurisdiction is wrong, and the fact that the opposition is raising the issue now when they were not prepared to do so in government is simply a matter of playing politics.
I want to turn now to this story in the Australian newspaper this morning about calls from the opposition, from Teresa Gambaro, the opposition citizenship spokeswoman, for personal hygiene lessons, for want of a better phrase, to be given to new immigrants to, she says, afford them all the proper measures, all the proper advantages when it comes to entering the Australian workforces. Suggestions, she says, things like teaching them that it's important to wear deodorant and not to push in to line. Gary Humphreys, where did this policy come from and why is it important?
Well, all that Teresa Gambaro is doing is highlighting the fact that we don't simply open the doors, admit a person to Australia and then leave them to themselves. We've really got to take the effort to make sure that Australian society welcomes and prepares people for citizenship of this country. And she's saying that there needs to be a much more active and focused campaign on what it is the new citizens need to prepare themselves for that role. And so giving people better tools to be able to understand the nature of Australian society. It's not just, the citizenship test or just knowing what the obligations under the law are as Australians. It's about giving people the tools in a social and personal sense to understand what it is that they do as Australians.
And things like wearing deodorant, not pushing into line, would that really help new immigrants, do you think?
I think that giving people a sense of what it is that Australian society is all about is quite important for people who haven't come from equivalent societies or societies with the same kind of norms. I think it is important to give people a sense of what it is that Australian society is all about. Whether it's deodorant or whether it's pushing into queues or whatever is not really important. The important point is that we don't simply say to citizens, you come through the door and you look after yourself after that. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to these people to give them the best chance of understanding how Australian society works and preparing them for that important responsibility of being a citizen of this country.
Kelvin Thomson, how's your side of politics viewing this? Is this an idea that has any merit?
Well, David, Gary was referring to new citizens. The reports this morning quoting Teresa Gambaro refer to the temporary entry workers who are here on those subclass 457 visas. Now, it also suggests mandatory cultural awareness training. I'm not sure how employers would respond to being expected to pay for mandatory cultural awareness training for temporary workers, and this question of who would accredit such courses, who would deliver them, whether they'd be the responsibility of the states or the Commonwealth. I'd like to see Banjo Patterson and Henry Lawson in there. Others would no doubt be suggesting something of Australia's Indigenous history. This looks to me like a bureaucratic nightmare, again, from the people who say that they are opposed to the nanny state. My own view is that instead of having the temporary entry permit system that we have, and last year we had 90,000 people come to Australia under that system, as well as 110,000 coming as skilled migrants, we ought to be putting the focus on educating and training young Australians. We have 500,000 people on New Start allowance, something like 800,000 people on disability support pensions. They are entitled to our first and foremost consideration. I think we should be reducing the number of temporary entry permits, the 90,000 visas, and focusing on skilling and training young Australians.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for this political discussion. I'm sorry to cut you short there. I see you taking a breath there, Gary. But thank you very much for your insights, Gary Humphries, Kelvin Thomson. We're going to take a very quick break. We'll be back after this with across to the United States to get the latest on the presidential race.